Yes. Det man kan registrera sig själv där. Någon som heter någonting Telia, tror jag. Ja, så kommer du nog till posthemsidan där. Så får du registrera dig och så kan du
All right, let's get started. So, welcome everyone to this session about failing continuous delivery. And I'm so happy to see there's so many of you that really wants to see how you fail. Anyhow, a short notice about who we are. My name is Deogun. This is Sawano. And we're both senior consultants at this firm called Point, who specializes in building high-quality software, like nobody else does, right? Anyhow, we're located in Stockholm, Gothenburg, Malmö, Umeå, and even in New York. So we have the small satellite in New York, which makes us globally, right? That was the boring part, so let's get started with the fun stuff.
Yes, let's jump right in. And let's start out by just talk a little bit about what we mean in this presentation, at least, and in general in the industry, when we say continuous integration, continuous delivery, and continuous deployment. What do we mean by that? What do we mean by those terms? A guy called Martin Fowler, you might have heard of him, was talking about a thing called continuous integration back in, I believe, in 2006 or something. And at that time, it was pretty mind-blowing. But today, continuous integration is pretty much a de facto way of doing software development. And Fowler stated that continuous integration is when a team that produces software or writes code continuously integrates their changes with each other. And they integrate by using some sort of automated build and test phase. And the whole purpose of doing continuous integration is that you want to detect possible integration errors as early as possible. So if we move on to continuous delivery, you need to understand that continuous integration is more or less a prerequisite for doing continuous delivery. So if you're not doing continuous integration today, or if you're struggling at it, then the tip is to get that sorted out first before you start looking at continuous delivery. So then a couple of other guys wrote a book called Continuous Delivery, which kind of put that term on the map. And Jess and David said that continuous delivery is about making sure that your software is always in a state that it could possibly be deployed if you chose to. So you're continuously building software, and any build in your pipeline, as the term used, can possibly be released. So then enters the term continuous deployment. So what is different? Well, Fowler talked about deployment, continuous deployment, and he said that every change that you do in your code should automatically be deployed or should be deployed into production. What Jess said, and I believe some blog post and article said that, well, continuous delivery is about making sure that any build that you do or any change could possibly be deployed into production if you choose to do that. So what is the difference? Well, the difference kind of is how often do you deploy or when you deploy. So the way we view it is that continuous delivery is about making sure that you can release at any time, but it's up to the business really to decide whether or not you want to deploy. And it's also about putting the choice or the decision about deploying or not in the hands of the business rather in the hands of the IT. Because you don't want to be having this scenario where you say like, well, we developed everything, but now we need so many weeks for testing, and we need 2 weeks for bug fixing, and 3 days to get them ready for production, and then we can deploy. You just want to be able to say, well, our code is already tested, already verified, and everything is done, so if you want to deploy, we'll do it tomorrow, do it today, it doesn't matter. While if you want to move to the continuous deployment part is, well, let's start deploy often and frequently. How often? Well, there are not really any set rules. It could be once a day, or once a week, once a month. It could be considered to be continuous deployment. It all depends on what market or what type of business you're running.
Right. So an important factor of introducing continuous delivery in an organization is to get an understanding of what actually drives that continuous delivery thing. And one aspect could be, if you're in an organization, the market might actually be the one that pushes it. Could be the shareholders, or it could be your competitors, right? All suddenly, when you are releasing a feature, a competitor seems to respond really quickly. If they only not respond quickly, they actually start beating you. They start adapting to whatever the users really wanted. And all suddenly, instead of being the market leader, you become second place all the time, right? So in that sense, the market might push for this. Another thing might be, if you've ever been in an organization where you do these bi-weekly or monthly or whatever the interval is, deployments to production. And they don't do that at office hours, right? They do it, late nights or even weekends. And what happens when you do that? Well, you have all these complex systems, and they seem to integrate in some weird fashion that stuff breaks. And so there's a lot of hot fixes. People are on their toes. They try to, keep their fingers crossed, say, hey, let's hope it works. And developers or the team might get really tired of this. They don't want to spend late nights and weekends and so on. So they might be the ones that drives continuous delivery. They want to say, hey, let's build software that's always production ready so that a deployment to production is just, ordinary business. Or it could be that the actual IT department is the one that drives and pushes for continuous delivery. It could be that the CEO comes up with this great idea, talks to the salespeople or whoever the CEO talks to, and they come up with this awesome business case, right? And it's all set. And now we just need to talk to IT, right? So they're really far down in the loop. And IT goes like, whoa, wait a minute, this is going to affect everything. Oh, we haven't been involved or anything. So IT gets really tired of this. So they want to make sure that in order to adapt to whatever they've come up with, we have a software in a production ready state. Nonetheless, when you start looking at continuous delivery, it's also important to understand how the organization views IT. If you're in a business where IT is the core domain, then it's really simple. Everybody understands that continuous delivery is probably the way to go. Implementing that is a piece of cake. However, if you're in an organization where IT is looked upon as supportive, then you're in trouble. Because then you need to convince them that, let's implement continuous delivery. And they go like, we're doing this and that's the important stuff. I mean, you have time. And even worse, if it turns out that they view it as supportive, but it turns out that it's core. Because then there will be competitors that used to have the same view as you that start to realize that, wait a minute, we're actually an IT company. And IT is our core business. Because now you need to convince them that, not only do we need to implement continuous delivery, we need to say that, IT is core business, and whatever you think is core is supported. And that makes it really hard. And just to illustrate how hard this is, I'm going to run a little quiz with you. So, how many of you think that Google thinks IT is core domain? Okay, a few hands. How many think it's supported? All right. I would probably go with core, but sure. Twitter, how many think it's core? Okay. Supportive. 1, 2 hands. Okay, that's good. This one. Apple. Is it core? Oh, there are not too many hands. Is it supportive? Actually more on the support side. Interesting. I mean, they're releasing a lot of software out there, right? They're making a lot of money off of it, but they're also a hardware company, so it makes it hard. And now, this one. I'm not saying Bank of America per se, but I'm saying banks in general. Where do you think they are? Is IT the core business? 4 or 5 hands. And then we have the supporting one. The rest. Really? At least in Sweden, we tend to close down all our stores, right? Or our offices, and we do everything off the internet. Interesting. So it's really tough. This makes it very hard to understand how should we push for continuous delivery.
So once we start to understand that depending on how you view IT, is it your core domain or a supporting domain, you will face different types of challenges when you're trying to implement continuous delivery full out and full scale. Now, in this presentation, we will look at a couple of those common challenges that we have found or encountered, and we will look at them mainly from 2 different perspectives, the business and the management perspective and the IT and the kind of development perspective. But one thing they have in common, all these types of challenges and problems and issues, is that they kind of have the same root causes, which is it kind of lies within the organization's structures, the processes around software development, and the people themselves that make up the organization. And since those are the root causes, sometimes when you're addressing these or trying to find solutions for these problems, it kind of feels like we're talking about the elephant in the room, right? So it's a little bit uncomfortable to bring this up, and you might, it's uncomfortable to talk about. But I think the important takeaway is to know that, excuse me, that you have to be aware that these challenges might occur, and when they occur, you need to be prepared to face them and just get rid of this. Just look at the elephant or just ignore it, but you need to talk about it. So, one challenge that you might run into when you're trying to implement continuous integration for real is that you might find that your current organization is not really designed or working in a way that it will allow you to continuously produce business value, if you will. So, in other words, you could say that your organization is not lean, if you want to use that term. So, for example, when you're developing software, and of course we were talking about the software in the IT industry, not the car industry or anything like that. Your software product kind of goes through a couple of cycles. You have this idea that this is a business idea, a product, and you kind of design it some way. And then you develop it, you need to test it, and you need to get it out in production and run it. And finally, your customers can get it. And these are kind of how it works. And it doesn't really matter if you work in Agile or Waterfall, but you need to go through all these steps one way or the other. That's normal. But the problem is, if your organization has departments or divisions or a structure that these steps are located within silos or there are strict walls around these, that tends to make it that the organization will actually prevent you from continuously delivering value or software. So this could look like, the business side or the business development side has this idea, but you try to develop this business idea to the most perfect, beautiful product ever that will change the world. And then you pass it on to the design, because the passing on part is kind of hard, and the design will try to polish this into the most beautiful thing you can do, and you develop it, and you develop the software developers build a system that is built for world domination, and so on. You get the picture. But that process will make it very slow, and it will actually take a very long time to get anything out to your customers. So you're not really continuously developing value, and value being something that is put in the hands of your customers. And there's a guy called Mel Conway who back in '67 wrote a paper where he said that, quote, organizations which design systems are constrained to produce designs which are copies of the communication structures of these organizations. And this, I think it was published in '68. But then a couple of years later, in '75, this guy called Fred Brooks wrote a book called The Mythical Man Month, which some of you might have read. And he took that statement and he dubbed it Conway's Law. What Conway actually was talking about is that the design of IT systems, IT architecture, and that your communication structure in your organization will actually limit or put constraints on what type of architectures you can create. We believe that you can take the same principles and viewpoint from Conway's law and apply that on business value. And if you do that, you will get something like this. Organizations which design IT products are constrained to produce business value at a rate limited by the organizational structure. So you can say that your organizational structure could limit, or could be a limit, for the pace that you can produce software or products of business value. Now, there's a term called inverse Conway maneuver. You might have heard of it. And ThoughtWorks on their technology radar defines that as a process of evolving your team and organizational structure to promote your desired IT architecture. It's basically about recognizing the implications of Conway's law and then flipping it around and saying, well, we want this IT architecture. Let's see if maybe we need to rearrange the way we work within our organization to enable us to build that architecture. And in the same way, we think that you should also be aware that when you're moving towards continuous delivery, which is all about continuously producing business value and getting products out to your customers, you might need to consider that maybe you need to change your organizational structure in order to enable that continuous value creating process. And this, depending on if you're viewing IT as your core domain or not, this may be a no-brainer, it might be hard or difficult. But we think you need to consider doing an inverse Conway maneuver based on business value. So organizations that are struggling with this, they have an organization structure that have this built-in inertia, they tend to have very slow cycles when it comes to producing or getting things out to the customers. Maybe once a year you're doing a release or once a quarter, and I'm still talking about business releases as in products getting out, not IT releases. So what you need to be aware of is that you have to have a mindset when you're deciding that let's go towards continuous delivery. You need to have the mindset that we need to change and maybe adapt in order to facilitate this more agile process, if you will. Again, you need to be open-minded and be prepared to change something different to get into this mindset of continuous delivery.
Right, so assuming that you have actually, as an organization, starting to understand what you need to do, you are understanding that, okay, we are embracing continuous delivery, or at least we're not working against it, right? We're preventing it from happening. Then you need to start looking at processes. And I'm not sure about you guys, but when I see this picture, I start, I wonder what kind of process I'm thinking of. But it's a sequential process, and it usually comes from the fact that people tend to look upon software as the same way as you build, let's say, cars, bridges, or an assembly line type of fashion, right? You start with piece A, go to B and C and so on, and when you reach the end, you're done. And as we all know, it's an iterative process, right? You all feel this by heart. So the key here is that you really need to start making a cultural shift in your organization, right? And your processes need to be adapted to what you need to do. You need to start designing processes that are specialized in delivering business value, not in a sequential fashion. So your processes will probably start looking at this. You need to know when to stop polishing the diamond. You probably heard this. Some people say good enough. Some say you should not build the holy grail. Yes, you heard that. But the key point here is that you need to start looking at software in a way that, okay, how can we get this to customers really fast? There's this famous guy called Eric Ries. He published a book called Lean Startup, and he mentioned something called the minimum value product. And there's also the open source community. I don't know if you read the Cathedral and the Bazaar, where they said basically release often, release often, release quick,
release early,
early. And listen to your customers, right? And both those ideas are actually focusing on the same thing. You don't really know if an idea is going to end up making money until it's actually tested among the customers, right? So even though it looks great on paper, it needs to get out there in order to make revenue. So you should actually start thinking release, measure, improve, and perhaps abort. So if you start polishing and polishing and polishing, and when it gets out there, it might be really costly because it turns out to be wrong.
So let's look at the business or the management part. If you look at our industry that we're all in, and you look at how it kind of developed during the last couple of years and what it might be in the future, you realize that the IT industry and the software market is getting increasingly more and more demanding. It's getting more competitive. This puts demands on being more cost efficient. You need to have shorter time to market. The users are demanding more, which puts higher demands on the systems themselves. So they need to be more complex. They need to be designed more professionally, if you will. They need to be able to handle all this high traffic, the low latency, and all that. And the thing is, you might think that, well, this is an IT problem, just solve it. It's tech. But when you get these really complex systems, and the system gets more complex, the management process that you always need to kind of govern your business development actually gets more complex too. So the thing is, the management that is controlling this process or running it or supporting it, they need to understand the IT industry. So what you really need is something that we call IT management. And IT management is, let's say your IT is your core domain, then IT is your business and business is your IT. So IT and management kind of fuses together. There's really no difference. And that's what IT management is all about. And the management roles that you need in order to support your development process, those roles needs to be filled by, you can say, a new breed of managers if you want to, but a different type of management. A management that can really understand the business, the industry that we are. You can't only be a business only or MBA only manager. We think that, and we're already seeing this within tech startups or tech only companies, that the managers and the leaders themselves are kind of brought from the tech side, from developers, from architects. You have a tech background because you need to understand the IT industry. And it's becoming so complex that you need knowledge of IT and the software industry in order to actually be able to run a company successfully.
Okay, so we have looked at the organizations, the processes, and the business, but now we need to look at ourselves, right? What about IT? Are we perfect? Do we know what to do? Of course not. And in order to realize this, as an organization, we should really look at something called cycle time. And Jess Humble and David Farley defined in their book Continuous Delivery is that cycle time, that's the time it takes from deciding to make a change, whether a bug fix or a feature, to having it available to users. And that really makes sense. Somebody comes up with an idea, let's say that was the CEO or whoever it was, and it gets to the IT department and they do their stuff, and eventually we deploy it into production and the users either hate it or like it. And if you look at this in your organization and try to measure it and say, okay, let's assume I get this idea, how long will it take before it reaches production? If it takes too long, you probably have either the processes or your organization or something is messed up. So you have this inertia in there that prevents you from actually doing continuous delivery successfully. I would probably say that it should take you, well, at most 24 hours. It's going to take you some time to run through all the tests and everything, right? You can also test it by, I'll change this one line of code, how long does it take before it reaches my customer? Then we have a little time here before that, it should probably be taken into consideration, but that's a good measurement.
So cycle time is an important aspect or consideration in continuous delivery. And when you look at the IT part, the development and testing and all that part of your value pipeline, then a big chunk tends to be if you do a lot of manual testing. If you can reduce the amount of manual testing, you can really reduce your cycle time. It's kind of a no-brainer. I think most people would agree, especially us developers and testers who works with code. So we can all agree that just automate that shit and we're done. But once you start doing that, you're getting more and more automated tests, then you start to realize things that you maybe you didn't think of when you first started. You get some implications that will affect you and the entire business. One of them is that you might realize, well, that the competence and the knowledge that we have among developers, architects, testers, and everything, maybe we don't have the skills to produce systems that are this complex or that allow you to actually test things in isolation in different environments and in an automated manner. So you get the realization that you need to bump up your competence in some way. We also notice that the business analysts and your domain experts might not be ready for producing business requirements that are formulated in a way that they actually can be verified in an automated way. And that's actually a little bit harder than you might think, because your requirements suddenly needs to be very specific. You can't have this fluffy requirement that, I want to make business. It needs to be something that is easily verifiable. And that can be a challenge. And as Daniel talked about earlier, the business as a whole, and that includes everyone in the company, needs to have a mindset of good enough, when to stop polishing the product or a diamond, in order to have this fast feedback.
Right. So assuming you get that in place, then in order to automate stuff, you're going to use test data, right? And all suddenly, the organization and business might start realizing, wait a minute, all this test data and managing it is really costly. Who's going to be paying for it? I mean, aren't you building stuff that works? Can't you ship it? No, we can't, right? So just to illustrate why this is so costly, first of all, if you have a really complex system architecture, you are going to have to get an understanding of how should we generate data that interacts with all these systems. Right? Should we use production data? That is one way of doing it, right? But then you come into question about, are there any sensitive material in there? And if so, how do we filter that out without actually making it biased somehow? So our sampling process becomes correct, right? Because if you change something, well, suddenly we are starting running tests with fictive data that sort of makes the data a perfect match for our systems. Another thing is that what happens when data goes stale? Well, suddenly it could be that we have so much old data in there, and that it's not really representative for whatever we're trying to do, is that all our tests are starting to get slow. It could also be that our samples are really poor, because we only get data that doesn't represent what we're trying to do. And of course, you should own this. You should be responsible for all the data that interacts with all these different systems, because the developers from these systems do not communicate. They're in different departments or whatever. One might be in India, one might be in the States, one might be in Sweden, and so on.
And another thing that you might realize is that the more you automate, the bigger and more complete and full pipelines you get, the more test environments you get. Suddenly you need hardware to run that. You need build servers that can test everything fast because you want fast feedbacks. You need test environments. You know, let's say I go to my test environment and then I go to my stage environment and whatever in your pipeline. You need hardware that can run all this. And it really doesn't matter if you're running in the cloud and you can spin up for virtual servers or if you run your own hardware, but that is going to cost, hardware costs. And as I mentioned earlier, you might need to invest in training to bump the competence within your team or your company. Or you need to hire people to get competence, staff or consultants or whatever. So there might be, you might cut down on costs in the way that, in the view that, in the sense that you shorten time to market, but you will get other costs and you need to prepare for that. Because then you have the issue, who's going to take the cost? If you have an organization that is divided in divisions, and one team is building something and you need a lot of test other systems that belongs to other departments, they need to be in different environments for you to run your pipeline. Do they want to pay for that? So you get in this horrible budget issue, but you're going to face it somehow.
Right. And when you have that figured out, you say, okay, I'm going to pay for it. They're like, yeah, let's do this. And all of a sudden they start realizing, whoa, we have all these legacy systems, right? And these legacy systems are not designed for automatic tests. Either the APIs are really poor or they just, I don't know, they just don't work well with automated scripts. And we all know that. And we all, almost everyone at least, don't like working in legacy code because it's so crappy, it reeks. So then the question comes, should we update it? Should we redesign it? Who should pay for it? Should we have a separate team that does it? All for us making this pipeline go all the way to production, right? So we need to understand how the data flows, makes it really tough. And all suddenly we start realizing, wait a minute, these legacy systems, they're only one generation. It's a one generation architecture. That means that if we shut it down due to maintenance or upgrade or wherever it is, all suddenly our pipeline stops. We can't run tests against it. So we need a multi-generational architecture in order to do like a canary delivery thing. And that costs money. How should we do it? And all of this because somebody has said, just automate that shit. It's so easy, right? It takes so much time to do this manually, so we're going to automate it. Of course, makes perfect sense. So this could either be the best thing that's happened for you or the worst thing. It really depends on how you look at it. Right. Another interesting part for IT is the risk reduction release dilemma. And I think the best way to explain this is to have this small animated conversation. I think I was supposed to be business, so you have to run on the other side. Yeah.
We're going to demonstrate our acting abilities here.
Yes. All right. So here we go. Here are the requirements.
Okay. It's an awful lot of requirements. Can you prioritize this?
Sure. We want them all.
Okay. No, really. You need to prioritize it. I don't know where to start.
Come on. It's only must-haves. So do them all.
Okay, sure. We can do them all, but we're going to do one at a time, and then we're going to release one at a time, continuously.
What? No way. Last time we did that, all system went banana and we lost bazillions of money, right?
Yeah, but that was because...
No buts. Whoops.
Press the wrong button.
Darn it! Failure. Sorry about that.
This presentation is about failures.
Yes.
That was rare.
See, went banana. But no buts. We need to reduce risk, right? So we need to release less often with more features. Okay.
But if you cram more features in your releases and your release gets bigger, wouldn't that kind of increase risk rather than reducing it?
What? No way. Let's get this project started. Time is money.
Okay.
Yes, boss. All right. So if you analyze this,
like we're not actors,
right? If you have this conversation, or if you actually encounter it somehow, we need to start realizing why business is acting this way. And there are mostly three things, right? First thing is that there seem to be, they're trying to do a lot of releases, apparently. And every time they did that, stuff went, haywire, and systems went down because they have probably a lot of manual tests. And bugs just slip through. So it was really costly. Systems were down, people were, upset, hot fixes, and so on and so forth. So therefore, they decided to, let's do this less frequently, but we increase the feature sets, and we're going to test it once, and it's done, right? So we know for sure that it works. And of course, the organization seems to be having this mindset of, I have my one chance to get everything in there, so I'm only going to put in the must-haves, and I'm going to add some few more things in there because they are going to, decrease my list. So, anyhow, now you know what to say, of course. Right, so what are the key takeaways from this? One thing is that you need to realize when you start talking about continuous delivery is how your organization looks upon IT. Is it core or is it supportive? And if it's core, it's a no-brainer. You're going to get it through. If it's supportive, well, it's going to be some struggle, right? And it's even worse if they look upon it as supportive, but it turns out that it is core, because then you need to convince them that whatever they believe is core is wrong, it's actually supportive. And now we need to introduce this new cool thing called continuous delivery. Cycle time. That's also a very important measurement that will tell you how well adapted your organization is for continuous delivery. You can measure this, and it can be rough estimates, right? But you can say, okay, is it 1 day? Is it 1 week? 1 month? Half a year? Is it once a year? How long does it take you to get stuff out the door? Of course, we have the processes in the organizations, and usually they tend to be created by people that has an old mindset that is not adapted for continuously delivering value, unfortunately. So therefore, there's a need for a cultural shift in your organization to understand how can we actually change our ways of doing things in order to get things out the door quickly, all the time.
Another takeaway, as we mentioned, was competence. How do you, when your system gets more and more complex, what do you do? How do you fill this gap that you might have? Well, there really is only basically 2 ways to solve that. You can train or you can hire. But both will cost money. If you just ignore it, you're probably just going to fail trying to implement continuous delivery full on. The management and the people that runs the businesses in the software industry, they really need to understand the industry itself. And again, if you're viewing IT as your core domain, it's probably going to be a no-brainer. You're always going to have that. That's going to be the spirit in the entire company. But if you're starting to realize that, wait a minute, our market our industry has transformed, and now suddenly IT is our core business, it's going to be a pretty big change to get that type of competence into your company. You need to start thinking and have the mindset of this minimum viable product type of thinking. You need to realize that if you want to be competitive, then you need to get things out to your customers really fast. Because otherwise, if you don't do that, you're just going to be a follower, if you're lucky. But if you can change that mindset and you can implement and start getting things out to your customers, you're going to be able to adapt to your competitors, and you might even become your market leader. And then you're on the game, at least for now. And the last takeaway, might be the most important, is actually before you even start to do this on a full scale and complete continuous delivery in the entire organization, you need to think and analyze, is this part of our vision? I mean, as a developer, the technology and the challenges that you need to tackle in order to get continuous delivery is pretty cool. And the technology is there, so it's not actually a problem, but it's cool. But if IT is not your core domain, and maybe it is, but you're not in a very competitive market, then maybe it's not worth it to go through all this trouble and all this costs and everything to get to continuous delivery if you don't really need it. So the conclusion might be that, well, it's cool, but we don't need it, so we're not going to do it. And that can be boring for us tech people, but for the organization as a whole, you really need to consider it. Do you want to do it because you need it or just because it's cool?
Right, so we reached the point of Q&A. We actually have 5 minutes and 15 seconds. So fire away. Yes?
You have all these challenges you talked about when you said you should automate that shit. So did you really, I didn't see any conclusion. It was like more, should we always automate or should we save some for manual testing because it's so expensive to automate it? Or
See, so the question is that should we always automate things or should we leave stuff for manual testing? So I think you sort of answered your question there yourself. No, we should not automate everything. If it's too expensive, we might actually say, okay, we measure the cycle time. You see that, okay, this is automated, that goes quickly, right? We have this little tiny part here that's going to take us, man years to automate. It's so complex and so difficult, but it takes us 1 hour to do manual testing. Okay, that makes it very easy. So, yeah.
I just want to fill in on that question. That's okay?
Sure.
I think it's important to automate everything that is in the release pipe. And then, exploratory testing and learning about your system and stuff like that should be there and should be manual, but should not be blocking any production releases. And I think that's a big mindset change because at least we have always been using the term exploratory testing as something where we hide manual regression testing, and those are, I think, important to actually invest quite heavily into getting away. But
so that's a very good point.
So don't block, but still do manual.
Yeah, because sometimes you get this question, well, you automate anything, you're going to make the testers unemployed. No, we're not saying that. It's not going to happen because it's the opposite. You're making testers more valuable because instead of doing this monkey work, automating just regression testing, as you put it, you're actually the tester is going to be more valuable because you're doing exploratory testings. They're going to become more of a kind of test engineers, if you will. So they're still going to be needed, but they're going to do actually more valuable work. And as you say, the simple stuff that you actually don't need humans to do, you just try to automate that. It's a very good point.
I was going to say, how do you automate non-functional testing? Most of the times I've seen this, people automate functional testing, but not non-functional.
Well, that's tricky. How do you automate non-functional tests or non-functional requirements, right?
You think about load testing and things like that.
Load testing is probably the easiest, but
Most obvious.
high availability, consistency and phase of failure, those sort of tests, the things that tend to screw up.
Right. No, that is hard, and of course you need to start, figuring out. Okay, when we saw this, usually in production, what was the behavior? We saw these spikes all suddenly, and it happens at this time of day. Okay, what's the load here? How can we, do that? Can we simulate this somehow? And so it's very hard. So that part might not be able. We might be able to automate it.
Sometimes maybe you're not able to automate it. Sometimes you can mitigate it by design. For example, let's take resilience, for example. If you know the work of the open source stuff that's coming out of Netflix, for example, it's really hard to automate that kind of stuff. You can have this different monkey army running around and killing stuff, but it's not going to be deterministic. You can kind of build a design that will minimize the problems. And then maybe you can get away with not automating the tests for that and so on.
Can I still fill in on that question?
Perfect.
So,
thank you.
One thing that is a problem is that, failover tests and rollback tests and all these kind of tests that are actually, where you're testing negative scenarios, it's very hard to automate, because if you figure out that scenario, then you probably already have it fixed and working. So I mean, continuous delivery is a lot about going forward, doing compatibility tests instead of rollback tests, and I mean, making sure that you have resilience and horizontal scaling and stuff like that. And by having that, you kind of increase the resilience. And testing horizontal scaling is possible. It's harder to test failover. So trying to find positive scenarios for these things and testing them, I think is important.
Yeah. Okay, I think we have time for one last question. I guess we ran out of time there. All right. Thank you so much.
We would like to thank you for
Oh, thank you.
Cool. Fire break,
Oh.